Hey everybody, Marshall here to share some really cool news with you. I trust at this point you've all heard about Kvik yeast. This is that Norwegian ale strain that can ferment cleanly at temperatures as high as, no joke, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 38 degrees Celsius. Absolutely crazy stuff. Well, last year, Imperial Yeast dropped A43 Loki, their Kvik strain, as a seasonal release, which meant we all had a pretty small window to get our hands on some. Not anymore. Imperial Yeast recently announced they're making A43 Loki a year-round strain due to popular demand. They're excited about it. I'm super excited about it. I've had some amazing beers fermented with Loki at terrifyingly warm temperatures. It is amazing stuff. Go grab some A43 Loki and see what all the fuss is about for yourself. Like many, when I first got into homebrewing, I stuck to making ale. Not because I wasn't a fan of Munich Dunkel, German Pils, and other types of lager beer, but rather I'd been convinced that brewing such styles was very difficult, requiring not only more gear, but a level of patience I admittedly did not possess. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott. And for this exBEERience episode, I'm joined by contributor Cade Jobe to talk about our experiences brewing lager styles using a number of different methods.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one again. Brewing lager is what I end up spending most of my time brewing. I mean, it's hot in Texas for most of the year. It's been nice 70-degree weather all through January. So having a crisp, clean lager around is pretty much a staple here, and learning quick lagering methods, warm lagering. We'll be going through all of that today, and also some traditional methods, and talking about our experiences and how we make this wonderful lagery beverage.
Hell yeah, man! And I'll never forget what it was like to brew my very first lager back in 2012, which was, a decade after I started homebrewing. It was a Bohemian Pilsner that took over 2 months to get from grain to glass, and while it was good, it certainly made me realize I had what it takes to brew such delicate styles, but it also led me down this path of questioning and experimenting, which has definitely impacted the way that I view making lagers these days. All right, we've got some really cool stuff coming up here in February. New Realms Mitch Steele, formerly of Stone Brewing fame, will be taking questions from patrons of Brewlosophy, those people who contribute a small monthly amount of money to support our efforts. For just $3 a month, you can be a part of all of these Q&A sessions as well. We have various pledge levels with other rad rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com. You can learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Without our patrons, we would not be here. So thanks a heap to everyone who's been helping us out in that way. Again, you can learn or see all of the rewards that we'll give you in exchange for your support over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And please consider leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts. We read every single one of those reviews and appreciate what you all have to say. Feedback this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers excellent stainless gear such as the turnkey BH15 pilot brewing system, which has a hard-plumbed manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Brewers Hardware has a ton of unique purpose-built products useful to both professionals and homebrewers. Go see for yourself at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Listener Jonathan emailed me with something I've actually been meaning to address for the last month. Here's what he said. I'm curious why you stopped posting the podcast on SoundCloud. I did find it on your website, but my work internet does not allow to play whatever format or host you're using now. SoundCloud worked really well for me in terms of actually getting it to play, as well as checking all of my other podcasts in one place today. So when we started the Brewlosophy podcast back in February of 2017, I didn't really know much about how this whole podcasting thing worked. Having recorded my own music for years, I had a decent grasp on the audio end of things. But I just wasn't, I could make stuff sound good, but I didn't really understand what a podcasting host was. I did my research to get us going, basically was my point back then, but I really was going in blind. Again, because of my music background, I ended up setting up our stuff on the SoundCloud platform because that's kind of what I knew. I knew that there was a lot of musicians who use that, and they did have a podcasting function. It worked fine for what we were doing then, but seeing as it really is set up for musicians, it also had a bunch of limitations for us doing the podcast. What finally pushed us to the point of switching to Libsyn, which is the host that we're with now, is the prospect, now don't get too excited just yet, of starting totally new shows on the Brewlosophy network, if you will. Again, we don't have any plans set in stone to do that just yet, but knowing that we can, that we have the capacity to do that, may motivate us to start some new things. With SoundCloud, we wouldn't have been able to do that. If you happen to have noticed that your podcast feed indicated that all past episodes of the Brewlosophy podcast are new or unlistened to, that's why. It's really no big deal. You can just scroll past them and listen to the newer episodes, and we've no plans to do anything like that again. Unfortunately, for some people like Jonathan, this switch had the effect of making our show unlistenable due to individual work restrictions, I guess. It sucks to have something, then lose it. I get that. The only thing I might recommend is try listening to the show on other platforms that maybe you have open access to at work, Jonathan, something like Stitcher or Google Podcasts, both of which work fine for a few people that I've heard from. So again, in the long run, this is a good thing, I promise, even though it's costing us quite a bit more upfront, and it's limiting other people's ability to listen in the places that they want to listen. But it really does open us up to for more opportunities for growth. So,
we've over the years, again, I'm not going to say anything too much, but we've been kicking around some ideas for podcasts. But if any listeners out there have some ideas for some Brewlosophy Network type podcast shows, shoot them over to us, and we'll consider them, toss them around, and see if we like them.
Yeah, and I know that Matt Del Fiaco and Malcolm have both been talking about spinoff shows that are focused specifically on a certain topic and stuff like that. The thing about a podcast, I don't think people realize this. If you want it to be a good one, maybe this is personal bias, but if you want a good one, you got to invest some effort into it. You don't just sit down at a mic and shoot the shit. I mean, that's just not how things work. So, but again, being on the Libsyn platform opens us up to a lot more opportunity. So we can do that now, and that may motivate us to do so. So, well, thank you for the feedback, Jonathan. I know that that's a bummer that you can't listen to the show the way that you used to. Hopefully there are other ways you can. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a line on social media. Now, some of our listeners may know contributor Malcolm Fraser recently went pro and is currently working with Fatheads Brewery out of Cleveland, Ohio. I hadn't heard about Fatheads up until, I don't know, maybe a year ago, but it seems like their name is popping up all of the time now. Well, we can't get Fatheads out here in California. You're not going to find it on the supermarket shelves over here in Fresno. So with Malcolm working there, I was pretty confident I'd be getting some sent to me, which I did, but it wasn't from Malcolm. Rather, it was listener Kenny Hyman who sent me a can of Fathead's Strange Magic IPA, and of course, I had to share it with my friends.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Whoa, fruity fruit. Ooh. Oh, exciting fruit. Like I smell some fruit that I'm excited to taste.
Strong IPA.
Oh, an IPA? Is that what you off of the smell?
Take a sip.
You don't know shit, Lebowski. Yeah, it's an IPA. I hate you. I love you, and I also hate you. It's a fruity IPA. Oh, I love IPA. I love this.
That's fruity, dude?
It's not IPA.
Floral.
Because we think it's IPA, it's going to not be. I'm like 100% this is an IPA, but I'm like, what if it's not? Malcolm's going to laugh his ass off at me.
It's good.
Guess who's starting to like IPAs?
I've actually started to like them.
Yeah.
That hurts to say.
I like this. It's really like lots of florally fruity.
I'm just giving you the floral. It's juicy. It's good.
Yeah, it's good. It's really good.
It doesn't sit there and linger on either.
I like IPA, but I haven't had them on tap, and I don't order them so often that when I do get a good one, it reminds me that I like this and I need to drink more of it.
It's not like hanging around forever after you drink it.
Like your in-laws at Thanksgiving. Okay, that's a good dinner. Guess we all need to get on the road now. That's delicious. I like that.
Yeah.
I'd take another.
I'm going with a 10 on that.
You're over the top now.
That's good.
Okay, I'll give it a 6 to counterbalance you.
First off, who doesn't love ELO, eh? Oh man, Strange Magic, great song, and the beer was equally as great in my opinion. Very classic American IPA. I agree with the guys, fruity, floral. It was very dry, easy to drink, man. One of those IPAs that took me back. The kind that I want to drink all the time. Very, very good. Cade, I'm pretty sure you've mentioned to me before that you've had Fatheads beer, right?
Oh yeah, I've had Fatheads. I went to their spot up in Portland whenever I was in Portland a few years back. Great brewery, just really making some good stuff up there. Really enjoyed it. I haven't had Strange Magic, but it sounded like an incredible beer. Nice IPA. So, if I see it, I don't know that Fatheads is actually on the shelves here in Texas either. But if I could get my hands on it, I'll sure be trying some.
Oh, dude, I was kind of anxious to try it with Malcolm working there and with all the good that I've been hearing about the beers that Fathead's pushing out. Definitely not oversold. It was very delicious. Again, I could just drink it all the time. Now, you have some cool news as well. Malcolm went pro. Cade, you recently made a big change in your life as well. Any chance I'll be getting some Blue Owl beers in the future?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. Yeah. So in January of this year, I made the switch from divorce lawyer to sour quality control and cellaring at Blue Owl Brewing here in Austin. So I made the big leap, going pro.
Yeah, some might think you were crazy for doing that, Cade, but you seem happy with the decision.
Actually, is surprisingly, most people that I've talked to have been really supportive. I mean, everybody's got the question. No, wait. You were a lawyer and now you're cleaning fermenters. Yes, I am, and I love it. But yeah, Blue Owl's a great brewery. We do sour mash stuffs. It's on the east side here in Austin. So anybody, if you're in town, come hit me up and we can have a beer.
That's awesome, man. Blue Owl Brewery in Austin, Texas. Cade Jobe working as a professional now from divorce lawyer. It's mind blowing to me, but I'm so happy for you. And I know that Malcolm's having a blast doing it as well. Thanks to Kenny Hyman for hooking me up with some Fatheads beer. I'm going to get on Malcolm about sending me some more for us to review, especially after my experience with Strange Magic. It was fantastic. So if you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. We got to give a little love to our sponsors. We'll be back in a minute talking about lager methods. This episode is brought to you by Milwaukee-based Spike Brewing, designer and manufacturer of premium quality homebrewing equipment. Whether you're interested in upgrading to a stainless steel fermenter like the incredible Flex Plus or switching to a turnkey electric setup so you can brew inside and avoid the cold, wet winter, Spike Brewing has the solution for you. Visit spikebrewing.com/brewlosophy today and let their team help you figure out what you need to make the most of your brew day. Again, that's spikebrewing.com/brewlosophy. Spike Brewing. Pursue what's possible. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. In my earlier days of brewing, it was very rare to come across somebody who was regularly making lagers, if at all. At the time, one of the more common excuses for this was, lagers were piss beer, fizzy yellow swill made by the big evil corporate brewers for mass consumption by less informed drinkers. Of course, the real reason had to do with the fact that we were afraid to give it a shot because of how difficult it was made out to be. I suppose the best place to start would be with the most traditional of lager methods.
Yeah, I mean, totally. So, lager brewing, I think most people that are listening to this podcast understand that lagering was traditionally meant to store your beer for an extended period of time, right? It originated in Germany and over there in Europe, or at least supposedly originated in Germany. I think there's some history out there that has shown that people were storing beer in cold environments, cellars, caves, things like that. All across the world, because and as we all know, at some parts of the year it gets really hot, and hot beer can lead to bad things sometimes. So I think people on this podcast at least understand, hopefully, that lagering traditionally just meant to store your beer. But what eventually that developed into was it eventually produced a yeast that ferments at colder temperatures through natural selection and various other things. Storing that beer in the cave or cellar, a cool place, produced this beer that was nice, crisp, clean, didn't have as many of the esters or phenol profiles that some of the other ale beers that everybody was drinking around the time. And people started to really enjoy it, like it. And it made this lager beer that we kind of know and love today.
Right. One of the things that you mentioned that I find fascinating and that could take me down a rabbit hole, it kind of has taken me down a rabbit hole a few times, is this concept of the specific yeast that we know and love today for producing these crisp, clean lager beers. Saccharomyces pastorianus, as opposed to the ale version, which is Cerevisiae. That it was naturally, in some way, naturally selected. You talk to a lot of people who love or hate them, who understand how lagers work and get the methods for them, how they're made and whatnot. A lot of them speak to, it's almost like the way they talk about lager yeast is that us humans had a hand in selecting it to make this style of beer that we love so much. But everything historically that I can find, and maybe I'm just a terrible historian, seems to suggest that it was kind of the opposite way. It's like these guys were, or these people, in fact, I think it was mostly women who were making beer back then. But they would make this wort, and then given their specific environmental constraints and the resources they had available to them, they'd set this wort aside and put it in these caves to keep it cool and out of the sun and all of that. And it just so happened that environment was worked really well for this Pastorianus strain. And so it's almost like the beer selected the yeast as opposed to the brewer selecting the yeast. And it just so happened to create this style that we really, or these styles now, I guess, but this lager style of beer that we also enjoy so much.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to talk about it, or to think of it. I hadn't really heard that before. And if I remember correctly, I could be totally wrong on this, but if I remember correctly, I think there's been some studies that have come out recently that suggest that the Pastorianus, or what we've traditionally been talking about as a lager strain, was just a mutation, or resulted as a mutation from, an ale strain. So like you said, the yeast itself adjusting, adapting to its conditions, and obviously it bears in mind that we didn't even know yeast existed until the 17 or 1800s.
Right, exactly.
I think it was 1700s.
And now we and very quickly, I mean, that's 300 years ago. Fine, we could learn a lot in 300 years, but it's still this living thing that we're still learning a lot about. I mean, even it's been the last decade that we've been talking about like two subtypes of lager yeasts. There's a lot to be learned about these, and yet we've because of the past, and we'll start talking about methods here in a minute. This is that rabbit hole I was talking about, but because of the past, kind of deferring to antiquity, that appeal to antiquity, we have accepted almost with dogmatic embrace that the way it was done is the way it has to be done. Again, we're going to talk about the way traditional lagers, the most traditional of methods here. And we'll get back to this when we get to talking about some of the crazier methods that some people scoff at us about. But okay, so disclaimer real quick. Our focus in this episode is going to be primarily on the treatment of wort and beer post-boil. There are people out there who are convinced that true lagers require special methods even earlier on than that, and that's totally fine. Maybe it does. I have yet to experiment too much with some of those methods. But this is going to be primarily post-boil focus. So the treatment of the wort and the beer once the boil is done, how it's chilled, fermented, and such. So now there's a lot of talk about the way things originally used to be done when making these lager beers. One of the first things that I thought was interesting with this is that there's arguments that I've read, again, historically, that once the wort is done being boiled and then chilled, you get it down as cold as possible. And then rather than, like I think most people do today, pitching your yeast and moving on from there, again, the most traditional of lager brewers will recommend that you actually rack the clearest wort off into another vessel for fermentation so that you leave as much trub behind as possible. Is that something that you've read about, Cade?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I think it kind of speaks to what keys, what we're looking for in a good, clean lager, right?
Absolutely.
A crisp, clean, and in my opinion, clear. And I think in a traditional, from a traditional perspective, that does also mean clear too. So racking over that the clearest wort that you can get, that starts from the mash tun all the way through the boil and into the fermenter. Trying to just keep it as clean as you can all the way through. And that makes sense. If we're storing this for a long time, I want to make sure that I've got clean wort that I'm storing. I don't want to have a bunch of other stuff, hop matter and trub and proteins and all that other stuff sitting in there for a long time that could potentially ruin my beer. So yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a part of the traditional lager brewing for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely recommended by Noonan in New Brewing Lager Beer, a very interesting, if somewhat slow to read book on lager brewing. But Greg Noonan is a genius. I mean, Greg Noonan, from I forget what the brewery was called before John Kimmich left The Alchemist, but I believe that's where Kimmich was kind of getting his ideas on how to make these hazy IPAs that are so popular today. So the guy knows what he's talking about, and that's one of the recommendations in New Brewing Lager Beer. Now, there are certain things that I think every brewer of lager beer has at least heard of, whether they're minding these recommendations or not. Obviously, I think the biggest one is the temperature at which you pitch and ferment the yeast. If you are going to stick with the most traditional of methods, you are not even considering pitching that yeast until it's at least 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius temperature, at which point you're going to pitch. I know a lot of people when they're using these more traditional methods who will chill their wort all the way down to 45, 46 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 8 degrees Celsius, 7 to 8 degrees Celsius, and then ferment at 48 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It just got that pitch cool in order to the argument being you want to suppress ester production as absolutely much as possible, and so the cooler you pitch, the more you're able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that even the yeast manufacturers are recommending on their. Well, I don't know if it's a recommendation. I would assume that I can call it a recommendation. It's on their packaging. For some of these lager yeasts, is fermentation temperatures between 45, 55 F or 7 to 12, 13 C. And the idea is because those yeast actually function very well at those temperatures, and they do produce fewer esters, fewer byproducts for fermentation. And fermentation temperature, to me, was the reason that I didn't start brewing lagers initially. The first probably 15, 20 batches of beer that I brewed were ales. Even though I prefer lagers, I preferred drinking lagers then. I prefer them now. I just didn't do it. And the main reason was because it's Texas. It's hot. I can't get down to 45 or 50 degrees in my house or in my garage or any place like that. I'd have to buy a fermentation chamber or make something that could actually be regulated or refrigerated and get down to those temperatures. So for me, a lot of the reason why I didn't brew lagers was because of this fermentation temperature problem.
I talk to a lot of homebrewers, and you are not alone, amigo. I'm in the same boat. I mean, I did the same thing. I started brewing in 2003, and I don't think I made my first lager until 2012, that Bohemian Pilsner. And I mean, I remember going through the whole traditional. I did everything like I'm talking about now. I mean, it was like, I'm not going to screw this thing up, and I didn't. The beer came out fantastic, but. So the other big thing that you hear people talk about when it comes to traditional lager fermentation is that because of the fact that fermentation activity is a function of temperature on some level, yeast activity is, that since you're pitching so cool and that you're fermenting so cool, you need to make sure that your pitch rate is very high, that the amount of yeast that you're tossing into that wort strong enough, it's viable enough to do its job properly and not stall not lag for too long. And so because of this, as opposed to the 0.75 million cells per degree Plato per milliliter of wort recommendation for ale pitch rates, for lagers, the common wisdom says to pitch 1.5 million cells, so double the amount of yeast so 1.5 million cells per degree Plato per milliliter of wort. For me, in my experience, when I'm fermenting this way, that usually means a yeast starter that's about 3 liters to 4 liters even sometimes in size. If I'm using a higher pitch count type of yeast, like imperial yeast, 200 billion cells, I might be able to get away with a 2-liter starter for the most part. If I'm fermenting, again, pitching at 48, 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C. But back in the days when I was making starters for all of my lagers, they were regularly 3 liters or larger.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Or, for me, whenever I didn't have starter equipment, pitching 3 or 4 vials of liquid yeast.
Right.
Or 2 packets of dry yeast whenever trying to get it in, trying to hit that pitch rate. And another reason why that pitch rate, people talk about that, is because we're going at low temperatures, so the yeast does actually work slower.
Yeah.
It's not as fast as at ale temperatures. It takes a lot more time, which actually, this just popped into my head. I wonder if this is why lagers pair so well with barbecue. Because low and slow, right? That's what they say about barbecue all the time. Isn't it kind of the same for lager?
Yeah,
low and slow.
It is low and slow. If they share the same dynamic, perhaps there's a some sort of a cosmic relationship between the two. But I feel like lager goes pretty great with everything. That's my opinion.
Oh, totally.
So because of the we were talking earlier about how traditionally, at least as is claimed by some or recommended by folks like Greg Noonan, that the wort is racked off of the trub after it's given some time to settle before the yeast is pitched. We do know nowadays, and I'm not sure that this was something that people were aware of way back in the day, but we know nowadays that trub actually does contain certain nutrients that are good for the yeast. We've done numerous experiments on kettle trub fermentations and have found that typically a wort that is fairly rich in kettle trub, one that hasn't been extensively filtered, will tend to start, fermentation kicks off a bit quicker. It can produce a clearer beer. It can produce a cleaner beer. If you're making one of these traditional lagers using these traditional methods, you are not going to have that kettle trub in there. And so there are certain things. I often wonder if this isn't why we got to the point of thinking that oxygenation was so important, because you add that oxygen and it does provide for the yeast. It does encourage that yeast to get kicking a lot faster. I don't, Ryan Heitzgebot would probably shy away from saying just openly, broadly add yeast nutrient. If you are using like dead yeast as the nutrient, I'm sure you could probably get away with that, but that's going to also contribute to a quicker start and perhaps a more healthy fermentation if you're making a traditional lager like this.
Yeah. I think some of those conditions also, you want to make sure that there's plenty of nutrients that are available because of the length of time that's also going to sit too. I don't know anything about the yeast or if they require more nutrients than say Cerevisiae does. I'm sure there's a study that's been done out there. If not, that's an opportunity for somebody to do one. But that was always sort of what was told to me was, you need to make sure that the yeast has the right amount of nutrients, especially when brewing lager beers, because they are going to be under a quote unquote more stressful, I guess, circumstance environment than an ale strain would be.
It makes sense. So let's see here. You're gonna once that yeast is pitched, you've oxygenated the wort, everything is good. You're just gonna hold it at that low temperature, again between 46 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 8 degrees to 10 degrees Celsius. And you're not gonna do anything to it at this point. We're talking again about the most traditional of methods. You're just going to let it ferment at that temperature for as long as you need to. And then what I've heard from some people, that one option is to just let it ferment out, let it finish up before moving on. And by moving on, we mean reduce that temperature and through what's referred to as that lagering phase. Lager translated just means storage, typical cold storage. But we've kind of come to colloquialize it, I think, in brewing as meaning, that gradual decrease in temperature and storing that beer cold to mature. Anyways, I've heard from some people that with about 1 degree Plato, which is approximately 4 SG points left in fermentation, so it's not fully done yet, that they'll start, or one method was to gently start reducing the temperature of that beer. And we're talking, 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit, I believe, like per 12 hours or so. And there was something said about, and I don't know much about this, but the claim was that the yeast activity during that gradual cool down contributes to some desirable flavor characteristic, that there's something occurring differently than if you were to let that beer fully ferment out and then start dropping the temperature. I've never actually tried that. I have zero experience doing that. Cade, maybe you do. Maybe you've never even heard of this before.
That's actually, I was going to say, that's the first time I've ever heard of that the actual chilling of the beer creates a desirable flavor characteristic. I mean, I would think the yeast is just totally speculation. Again, I have no personal experience on this, but I would think the yeast is doing its job. It's just chewing through things, living a little happy life, and then when it's done, it's done. Or it can go into a stationary phase if all the stuff that it's going to eat up is all gone, and if all the wort sugars and stuff have been consumed, and there's no more fermentables for it to consume, it's going to go into a stationary phase and just sort of go to sleep for a while. Hibernate, I guess.
Yeah. And I think the argument that I heard, and this was it's weird because I've never tried this. I'd never heard of it. And when I started talking about a method that we'll discuss here in a bit, the method that I had started using, somebody called me out and was like, well, you were completely skipping this step wherein the yeast continue to work as you're gradually decreasing the temperature of the beer. And that's what creates that lager character. Again, I'm not sure how many people are actually doing anything like that, but I felt it was worth noting because it sounds like some people do it. And it ended up being a pretty long conversation because I'd never heard of it. So that's one part of it. It sort of makes sense, right? If you're thinking about these people who are making lager beers hundreds of years ago, they don't have precise control over the temperature of their beer back then. They've got caves that are going to gradually, you just take it deeper into the cave to get it cooler and cooler and cooler. So there's going to naturally be a gentle kind of decrease in temperature. So if you're just deferring to, antiquity and what people did in the past, it makes sense why we might adopt some people might adopt an approach that more, resembles what they were doing back then.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I'm not sure that would result in a flavor characteristic. Again, I mean, I could be totally wrong on that. What I think is probably more likely is, in a traditional lagering method, the next step is to rack it from that primary into a secondary keg, right? So, and the purpose of that is to drop out sort of all of anything that may be up in the solution up there, clarify it again, and chilling results in things dropping out. Yeast that may be dead or dying drops out, hop matter, true proteins, all those things drop out. And then to me, that makes it easier then to rack clean beer into the secondary for the lagering process. That seems to make a little bit more sense about why people would, sort of slowly ramp everything down.
To start knocking stuff out, you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. To knock it out, but to knock out slowly so that you're not, you're not just crashing and stopping all fermentation activity. You're doing it slowly. You're letting the yeast continue to work, and
and that's and I think that's a good point. It is very one of the more traditional approaches to doing this, and I know that secondary fermentation vessels get a lot of nobody's using them anymore today, it seems like. But when you're talking about making a traditional lager that's going to be sitting around for a long time, it's common to get that beer, even after you've cold crashed it in the primary, if that's what you choose to do, you're still going to have a big slug of trub on the bottom, whether you cold crash or not, to get that beer, that lager beer off of that trub layer into a secondary vessel, which could be a keg. It could be another carboy. On the commercial scale, it just be another tank, a bright tank, something like that. And then that's really where the magic, quote unquote, happens. That's where you're going to start that lagering phase. which is, one of the most commonly cited recommendations comes from, again, Greg Noonan, who says to lager a beer for 1 week for every 2 degrees Plato or 8 SG points, which when you think about it, let's say you're brewing a 1050-ish OG beer, amounts to upwards of 6 weeks for, that's a standard strength beer. So lagering for a minimum of 6 weeks on top of all of the other stuff. A typical lager fermentation at 48 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degree-ish Celsius is going to take, for me in my experience, it's been about 8 days or so before it really starts to slow down. I usually would let it sit for another 2 to 3 days, so 10-ish days to 2 weeks. And then you're crashing it, racking it into another vessel, which for me has always been kegs, and letting it lager for another 6 to 7 to 8 weeks, depending on the strength of the beer. You're looking at over 2 months away from brew day, grain to glass, essentially, when using these methods.
Yeah, so here we get to the other problem, right? About why I didn't brew lagers whenever I was first brewing, because I want to drink my beer now.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, as soon as brew day's up, I'm like, all right, when is it going to go in the keg, or when's it going to go in the bottle, and when can I have some of this? So waiting 2 months is just a long time for me to wait for a beer.
Absolutely.
that I brewed. Done it, but it's a long time.
It's a long time. So you've used these more traditional methods before?
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the first podcasts we did the podcast on Kolsch's, and that was for a long time the only way that I would brew a Kolsch. I would brew it, and I would put it down, let it ferment at 50. I wouldn't do a diacetyl rest, which is what we'll talk about here in a minute, a tweak to a traditional method. I'd do sort of just this thing. So I'd let it ferment out. And then I generally wouldn't rack it over into a secondary, but I'd go ahead and rack it over into a keg and carbonate it, and then let it sit for at least 30 days, at least. And I was convinced that created the best Kolsch flavor. Letting it set for about 30 days, 6 weeks, so good.
Oh my God. Yeah, I'm perhaps more impatient than you. I have definitely used these traditional lager methods multiple times. I actually bought another chamber just so that I could always have lager beers going, at the time, just accepting that was the only way to make them. Again, it works fine. It takes a hell of a long time. And I always actually wondered about the impact that aging had on the flavor of the beer. I tend to prefer, fresh malt flavors, fresh hop character, all of that stuff. So I couldn't help but wonder, is all of this aging, is perhaps that quote unquote lager character that people are after really just a function of the fact that it's been sitting around for a long time? You do that with any ale or most other beers. And I think people would be like, man, it would be better if it was fresh, right? We love freshness. So over the years of brewing, using these methods, many of which again were employed purely as a function of the available resources that people had to them. I mean, there wasn't refrigeration, but Northern Europe is a pretty cool region. Knowledge of process increased naturally, as did available technology. With this, people began employing certain methods to expedite the process and or improve the product, at least subjectively. And one of the things that you hear talked about all of the time, and I'm sure people have been wondering why we're not bringing this up yet, a kind of a spin on the traditional method is what we refer to as the diacetyl rest.
Oh yeah, the VDKs, vicinal diketones. I've started using, by the way, just sort of as an aside, I've started using VDK whenever I refer to diacetyl, because there's actually two compounds, one of which is diacetyl, but then there's also 2,3-pentane dione, which is, they're both VDKs, and they both create that buttery butterscotch popcorn off flavor that you can taste in beer sometimes. So they are two different chemicals, so that's why I call it VDK. So if you hear me say VDK or diacetyl, I'm referring to that, sort of buttery popcorn butterscotch flavor. So that is an off flavor, right? I mean, I know I've personally tasted butter bombs before, a beer that somebody serves to me, and even I've brewed myself, that they serve and say, oh, here's this lager, tell me what you think. And I take a big drink of it, and it's like I just swigged a whole thing of, that squeezed butter, I don't even remember what the brand is, but it comes in that yellow the yellow squeeze bottle with the blue lid, and you just squeeze that butter out.
I can't believe it's not butter, because it's not butter.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, people were starting to taste this flavor and starting to wonder, how is this coming about? Like, what's causing this? VDKs are produced by the yeast and as part of fermentation. So it's a byproduct of fermentation, but the yeast also comes back and consumes those. So it'll actually take those back up inside of its cell wall and pull it out of the solution. You just have to give the yeast enough time to do it. So when we're lagering and letting lagers sit out for, 30 days, 6 months, or we're cooling or crashing them too fast, this could also be a reason why people did it slowly, because you're allowing the yeast to take the time to pull these things back out of solution and put them back in their cell walls.
Right. And to effectively clean the beer up, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so when we refer to the term diacetyl rest, which people can call a VDK rest if they want to, I suppose. But all that means is, some clever brewers were like, well, hey, we know that yeast is going to do their thing a bit faster and more effectively if we, in warmer environments. What if, with the understanding that the good portion of esters and phenols and undesirable stuff that we don't want in our lager beer are going to be produced in those first few days of fermentation? What if towards the end, while the beer still has a couple of points of, gravity points left to go, we gently ramp that beer up, 10 degrees Fahrenheit or so, which is like, what is that, like 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. Get it up there, maybe around 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Let the beer finish up at that warmer temperature so that it can take care of all of the diacetyl, the VDKs, and then also has the effect of encouraging a bit quicker fermentation. And that is, I believe that diacetyl rests have become common parlance because so many people are doing it now, whether they're making lagers or not. But it does seem to be a pretty typical spin off of the traditional method, and one that is arguably accepted by the old guard as being okay to do. It's not going to ruin your lager beer. Diacetyl rest won't ruin it. In fact, it may have the impact of producing perhaps a better beer, as long because that diacetyl has a less chance of being there.
Yeah, I think you'll see this a lot. This is something that we do at Blue Owl. We're not sometimes we're fermenting lagers, but doing ales and stuff. But yeah, we're doing a VDK test at the end of fermentation to make sure that all of that is out. So yeah, it makes sense. I think most brewers are actually doing this now, and I think a lot of people would even consider this part of now a traditional lagering or a lager brewing method.
Right.
Is that diacetyl rest where you crank up the temperature just a little bit, let the yeast finish out fermentation, take up all those byproducts, or at least as much of those byproducts as they can. Get it all out of solution before you send it over into the lagering phase, where it can, where the beer can sit and mature.
Yeah. The other kind of spin off of tradition that, again, I think some people may even view as more of a traditional approach, is relying on some form of filtration. There's this saying that I've heard before, that lager beer is ready when it's crystal clear. Some view the primary purpose of the long aging and lagering process as allowing the precipitates in the beer to fall out. And one way to reduce the weight is to filter that stuff out rather than, waiting for it to fall out, which can be done either mechanically or chemically. Now, just of note, Reinheitsgebot purists are going to disagree with that last part. You don't put anything other than water, hops, yeast, and malt in your beer. But you look at a lot of the lager breweries today who are filtering or using something like biofine clear, or gelatin seems to work as well. And it drops that stuff out. If it's the absence of certain proteins and polyphenols in the beer that give it that delectable lager character, that crystal clear, delicious lagerness that we all love, then removing it with something like a centrifuge, or like I said, gelatin or biofine or whatever, ought to reduce the time it takes for that beer to be ready as well.
Yeah, we're always only cold filtering too, right?
3 times, right? Yeah.
3 times, triple, 3-time cold filter. Yeah, so filtration or getting that beer to that clearest point. I think I started at the top of the segment talking about crisp, clean, and clear lager. So I think that's a goal. That's, again, what what one of the benefits of letting things sit for 30 days is the beer really does clarify and get and become nice and bright, brilliantly clear. And so there, a lot of people, looking at this going, okay, I really don't want to wait 2 months. I'm fine waiting, a long time, but I really don't want to wait 2 months. What are some ways I can shorten this? Well, if I do my diacetyl rest, increasing the temperature, I can maybe get the beer into my glass a little bit faster, and then filtering or using finings, gelatin, BioClear, or mechanical filtration, cold filtering, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, this makes sense. And I think, again, this is another one of those things where, again, adding chemicals to the beer, probably not okay for Reinheitsgebot, and probably not a more traditional way of doing this, of making clear beer in a lager method. But, I think that there's definitely some mechanical filtration or centrifugation or something like that people are doing that's traditionally helping beer get clearer faster.
I know people who are making commercial breweries who are making traditional lagers that are fined with gelatin or biofine clear or whatever, and they're coming out great. Now, both diacetyl rests and filtration do take certain steps away from the most traditional approaches to making lagers, like you said, Cade, but they're more or less accepted as being acceptable. Such is not the case for the methods that we're going to be digging into when we're back from these messages. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the exGEERience, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERience.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you, and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Back in early 2012, I was brewing pretty much every weekend and had picked up a second fermentation chamber solely to make lagers. I was too impatient to switch between 3-week turnaround ales and 6+ week turnaround lagers. This was a time in my brewing life where I really started thinking about things from different perspectives, kind of questioning the oft-spouted musts that I'd read in books and forums and heard on podcasts. And it was really opening up to the idea of experimenting with this stuff myself. One of the practices that I'd adopted when brewing ale was to ramp the temperature of the beer toward the tail end of fermentation, not necessarily to drive off diacetyl like we talked about in the last segment, but really to encourage a quicker finish. And so, I would basically pitch the yeast, and 2 days after I noticed fermentation activity, raise the temperature from 19 degrees C, about 66 F, up to 72 or 73 degrees Fahrenheit, which is something like 22 degrees C. And that always, my whole point in doing that was to spur on a quicker fermentation, a finish to fermentation. This was said to be okay because, again, esters are produced during the growth phase of fermentation, which is typically 1 to 3 days after pitching the yeast. Well, I started wondering why lager yeast, again, Saccharomyces pastorianus, wouldn't respond similarly. Is there something different about it compared to Cerevisiae? I did some poking around and couldn't find anything other than the typical very strong recommendations to not do what I was thinking about doing. So, of course, I did it, and it worked out pretty well. Now, just some credit where it's due. While discussing this method online the following year after I started messing around with it, somebody mentioned that they'd heard our friend Mike Tasty McDole from the Brewing Network talking about something similar that he was doing based off of Narcissus. Indeed, the methods that we talk about are pretty similar. My approach is probably a little bit less thoughtful, a little more haphazard in terms of timing and such. At least it was at the beginning. Anyway, these days I sort of clump all three together, the Narcissus / Tasty / Brewlosophy quick lager methods, under one umbrella, the quick lager brewing.
Yeah, I mean, this is my preferred method now. This is how I ferment all of my lagers these days.
And a lot of people, Cade. I hear from so many people who are relying on these methods, which have some very distinct differences from the more traditional approaches that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I was at a brewery Friday night, Last Stand here in Austin, and I was sitting there talking with a guy who stumbled on Brewlosophy's a website looking for a quick lagering method. So I mean, people are actually using this, and it seems to work. At least for me, works. I don't know if I can say as good as traditional lagering. But it's good enough for me and for what I want.
Yeah. I'll tell you this, that for better or for worse, the way that my brain works is what drove me into experimenting with this. I first off have this, I don't necessarily want to call it cynicism, because it's not like I think that there's any malice in the people who are talking about making lager beers in the first place. I feel like there's a lot of presumptions accepted as fact when it comes to brewing in general, and in particular making lager beers. So we, again, like we talked about before, there's this lager yeast, and it worked so well at cool temperatures that, we have to use it at cool temperatures now, and you have to keep it there, because if you raise the temp, but I'm going, well, man, if we're doing this, treating ale yeasts this way, lager yeast can't be that much different than ale yeast. I mean, maybe they produce different characteristics and aromatic and flavor compounds, but why can we get away with ramping temperatures after 2 days of fermentation when I'm making a blonde ale with Chico, and I can't do that with a lager? And that's really what spurred my experimentation. So what I ended up kind of settling on, what I wrote about on the website, which is one of the things that put Brewlosophy on the map, there's no denying that, is that in essence, what you do is you chill your wort, just like with traditional methods. You chill your wort down to a very, very cool temperature. For me, that was always 46 degrees Fahrenheit or 8 degrees C. And then that's when you pitch your yeast. So everything up to this point is pretty typical. You can rack off of the trub if you want to. I never did. I kind of ditched that practice because I saw the value in having some trub present for its nutritive aspects. Once the beer is about halfway done fermenting. Now the other thing is pitch rates. I was using the same exact pitch rates as you would for a traditional lager beer as well. So you're going to pitch those traditionally higher amounts of lager yeast. So once you're about halfway done fermenting, which is typically about 3 to 5 days into fermentation for most styles, at least in my experience, assuming your yeast is very viable, you start raising the temperature in the chamber by 5 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius every 12 hours or so until it reaches 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees C, room temperature. This is where we depart from traditional methods. You don't do this. So in essence, that takes about 4 days to get up to that 68 degrees Fahrenheit if you're fermenting somewhere between 48 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, fermentation activity will likely have slowed down or just be completely done. And so for me, you're 7 to 8 days into fermentation, the beer's already done. I would leave the beer alone for a few days just to make sure that nothing else is happening before taking a hydrometer measurement that almost always confirmed that FG had been reached. And that's also when I would do a VDK test, a forced diacetyl rest, right? And or test, making sure that there's no diacetyl. And again, you're raising it up through the much warmer temperatures than traditional diacetyl rests were completed. There's usually not going to be any there. And then at that point, so you're about a week or so, maybe 10 days into fermentation, I would start gently reducing the temperature in the chamber by 5 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 degrees Celsius every 12 hours until it gets down to freezing. 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees C. If you're really nervous, you can go 33 or 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree C. And it takes about a week for that to happen as well. So now you're just over 2 weeks in. The beer is nice and cold, sitting in your chamber. You let it sit there for another 2 to 3 days. If you want to, you can add finings at this point. I always did. I always added gelatin at this point. And then, you package it. And once it's packaged, and this whole quick lager method thing was based off of the when it's clear, it's ready to drink motto. And so if you're using that slow reduction in temperature and then you're fining with gelatin or Clarity Firm or something like that, usually by the time the beer's carbonated in the keg, and I always, use burst carbonation methods where I hit it with a high amount of gas and let it carbonate over a day or two. It was usually crystal clear and ready to drink. I never had an issue using this. Typical turnaround time, 3 weeks or so, similar to the ale that I was making back then, and way better than the 6 weeks plus that my previous lagers took. And I couldn't, after employing this method like 15 times, could not justify going back to the traditional methods, because in my anecdotal experience, brewing beers both ways, I just could not tell a difference. I didn't get any off flavors from the ramp up or the ramp down. Everything seemed to be working out really well for me using this method. And so it's what I stuck to. And like I said before, it seems like a lot of people are using this approach now.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my experience too. I mentioned a little bit earlier that whenever I would do a Kolsch, it's pretty much my house beer. It's the beer I always have on tap here. I used to do it using traditional methods. So that was taking all of those steps. It would take me 2 months to get a Kolsch into a keg and ready to drink, doing all the traditional steps. And it was, I'd say about 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, that I sort of stumbled onto this quick lagering method. I think it was through Brewlosophy that I stumbled onto it. I wasn't affiliated with Brewlosophy yet. Actually, it was more than 2 years, as I think about it. But anyway, I stumbled on this quick lager method, and I remember reading about it and just going, no, not going to work. This isn't, there's no way. Like and me in my mind going, no, I've done some things where I've like cut down the 30 days, or 45 days where it's sitting and lagering. I've cut that down to 2 weeks and it just doesn't taste the same. No, that's not right. So I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to brew a Kolsch. So, whatever. I'm just going to try it. I need to drink this beer in like a month or so. So I'm just going to try it. I'm not going to totally short and shoddy this Kolsch, but I'm going to brew it. I'm not going to worry about putting Trub into the fermenter. I'm going to do this, pitch at 50 for 4-7 days, something like that. And then raise it up, do a diacetyl rest, cold crash it, add my findings, and see the fastest time that I can get this together. I got it down to 2 weeks.
Yeah, dude.
Whenever I did that with the Kolsch. So the two things that I sort of look for are you're fermenting, and I'm not regularly pulling gravity measurements at this point because I've kind of understand how my equipment and my process works at home. But if you want to, you can pull a gravity reading when you get to that 50% attenuation. But I'm sort of watching for when the airloft or the blow off activity starts to go down. It starts to slow. I know that at that point, everything seems to be cranking back down. That's when I'll usually crank up the temperature to 68. And then once the airlock activity stops, I'll cut that off pretty much then. Sometimes I'll wait a day or two because I have noticed on a couple of batches, again, this is anecdotal, but I have noticed on a couple of batches that if you cut it off immediately, as soon as you don't see blow-off activity, there may still be some diacetyl, some VDK, and maybe a little bit of acetaldehyde that's still in the beer. So I may let it sit 1 or 2 days, but for this batch, I didn't. For this batch, I let it ferment 5 days at 50 degrees. It started to slow down, so I cut off, or I'm sorry, ramped it up to the diacetyl. I let it ferment for another 5 days, so that's 10 days that this thing has been in the fermenter. Crashed it overnight, added some biofine clear to it, got it in the keg, transferred it into the keg, and let it sit like a day and a half. Or 2 days at that point for 14 days. So I brewed it on a Saturday, and 2 weeks later, I was drinking that thing on a Saturday, and it was damn good,
dude. I'm telling you, when I first started doing this, I have this thing where I won't recommend or share ideas unless I have vetted that idea out extensively and I'm confident in it. I think I brewed probably 8+ batches of lager beer. I mean, I was shocked that this worked, which is when I think about where we've come with lager brewing just today, like in the last few years, I feel stupid being so shocked as I was back then. But I remember, same with you, I was turning beers around 2 to 3 weeks and I made a Pilsner, I made a Bohemian Pilsner, I made a Vienna lager, I made a Dunkel, I made all of these lager beers, and I'm sitting here going, oh my God, I can do it. I can make these beers that I love drinking, I love sharing, and I don't have to spend 2 months on them, and I can do this thing. And that's when I ultimately hit, I think it was before I even started brewlosophy.com, the blog, and I tossed up this idea in some forum, and oh my God, the crap that was slung my way. You obviously don't have the ability to detect esters. There's no way you can get away with ramping temperatures that high. I mean, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 C, that's a lot to some people. You can't do that without creating these issues. We know because we've heard about it before. And that was the typical argument. Again, huge inspiration for starting Brewlosophy and what we've been doing with the experiment series and whatnot, because I actually enjoy doing that stuff, and I don't mind being proven wrong either. It's kind of to me, that's a learning possibility. But so anyways, I was making these beers and cranking them out, and soon became known to be the guy who would always have lager beers on tap at my place. And, however much weight you want to put on, BJCP sanctioned competitions, I don't put much on them these days anymore. I think they're fun for a lot of people, but we're all, we all have our own opinions and whatnot. Anyways, I was submitting these beers in every competition that I was entering back then, and they'd always come back with positive reviews. I took a Märzen that I made using this. I think I turned the Märzen around and entered the beer in a competition 3 weeks after it was brewed. So everything was done and complete. It was crystal clear. I think it scored a 42 collectively, and took second place in So in that category, and that's what I'm saying is these beers, however you want to spin it, they were coming out good. And I know that there are some people out there, if I'm going to serve a beer made using this method, and I tell them that it was made using this method, they're going to find problems with it. If you don't tell them, typically they end up thinking that it's pretty decent. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I got a gold a year and a half ago using this method on a Kolsch. But then more recently for my son's first birthday party, I brewed a beer for him. It was an Oktoberfest. We called it Blocktoberfest because he's really into blocks. I know, chinchy name, but that's okay. So I brewed that. His birthday's in October, and I had about 3 weeks to get a beer because I waited around and just didn't get to it. Made that in Oktoberfest within 3 weeks, and that was incredible. I mean, we finished off that 5-gallon keg in about 2 weeks. I mean, granted, most of that was the party, the people drinking at the party, but I mean, everybody loved it. It was great, in my opinion.
It's cool. We've got one more crazy thing to talk about here, but if you have been holding off on making lager beers because of the time it takes, then this is a really good way to get into it and give it a shot at the very least. Kind of a blend of old school and more modern techniques that has been, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people these days, I'm sure, or at least batches have been made using these methods very successfully. My highest scoring lagers have been made using this method. Some of my highest scoring lagers. It works. Give it a shot. 2 to 3 weeks. A lot of people I know who are making, turning IPA around in a month still. I don't understand why, but that, this is the same amount of time for a lot of people who are brewing. So give it a shot. Now, after a few years of making lagers using this quicker method, I again, my mind got the better of me. I started wondering where exactly it was determined that such styles require cooler pitching rate or cooler pitching temps and fermentation temperatures. Everything I was reading seemed to be a spin-off of the accepted dogma, not necessarily science proving that cooler temperatures were responsible for the crisp, clean lager character that I loved so much. As a student of psychology who's massively interested in cognitive biases and logical fallacies, it made me think of post hoc ergo propter hoc, which translates to after this, therefore because of this. More simply put, since good lagers were produced when fermented cold, then cold fermentation must be the reason for good lagers.
The classic, the classic philosophical question. Because this is, then it must be because of this other thing.
Right. And that, I mean, I couldn't, in my head, I'm going, well, I've got all of the resources. I'm to the point in my brewing life where I don't care if I dump a batch. We know that ester and phenol development are in part a function of temperature, right? Largely in part of that. But in the grand scheme of things, in my mind, at least 16 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees F to 66 degrees F, which is 9C or 10 to 19C, really isn't that much. You've got this huge range of temperatures, and we're focused on that tiny little spot. Could it really be that such a relatively small increase in temperature would have that big of an impact? It was around this time that a local homebrewer stopped by my house. I'll never forget this, to take the triangle test, and he shared a bottle of Pilsner that he and his dad had made. Given how new he was to brewing, I had pretty low expectations. We all can relate with that. Lagers are really tough to make, and this guy hadn't been brewing for very long. But the beer was quite good, and there was definitely no esters or any other glaring flaws. I might have tweaked some stuff just to make it taste more how I like it, but it was clean, it was crisp, it had all of the stuff you'd expect from a decent, well-made lager. So when I started asking him about his process, the geek out thing that all of us brewers do, he mentioned that he'd fermented it at ambient temperatures in his garage. And at the time, he didn't really think that was an issue. He had no clue, which was kind of fun, kind of refreshing that not everybody's caught up in all of this stuff. Which at the time, though, it meant that the beer was fermented around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 18.5 degrees Celsius or so. I was floored that this beer wasn't just an abysmal mess, and I immediately started planning for the first lager fermentation temperature experiment, which ended up, as anybody who's been around long enough knows, returning non-significant results and completely changing my views forever. Before we get into this, Cade, have you ever fermented a traditional lager beer, a traditional typical lager style, like you would an ale?
Well, sort of. I've never actually fermented one like an ale, but I have done something a little bit, just tweaked it a little bit. But it's funny, I didn't want to lose this thought whenever you were going through here, because we've just spent this whole time talking about this quick lager, and I've talked about how this is my preferred method, but I was listening to that story and going, well, I wonder if it's strain dependent, or if they used one of the strains that's an ale yeast that's packaged as a lager yeast. All of these things that the dogma is so ingrained in all of us that even me sitting here talking on the podcast is thinking about all of these other things that
you're looking for a reason. Right? I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah, I'm looking for a reason to justify what the dogma is.
Yeah, and there's Occam's razor, right? The simplest explanation is usually the best. And in this case, I can't help but wonder if it's just that our understanding of the way lager yeast work just isn't as genius as we thought it was.
Yeah.
The method we're talking about now is warm fermentation of lager beers. Now, I get that that's going to spin some people. If you don't want to hear about it, you can turn this off. For the last, 2 years, the good majority of the lagers that I've made have been fermented at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 19 degrees C, exactly the same way that I ferment my ales, and I'm using traditional lager strains. So everything is the same except for the method, basically. It's the easiest way for me to make a lager as well. And given the fact that Imperial Yeast packages so many cells per pouch, I haven't had to make starters as often. There's usually more than enough because that wort is warm, 66F or so at pitch. I just toss a pouch in there. It gets going about 6 hours later. I leave it alone for 4 to 5 days. And then I ramp it up to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or so. It's 21 degrees C for a 1 to 2 day, diacetyl rest, really try to push that attenuation and that fermentation along. Once it's done fermenting, usually within 6 to 7 days, I take a hydrometer reading and FG's been reached. There's no diacetyl present that I can tell. I just immediately crash it down to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 0 C. I'm not doing any gradual, decreases in temperature. I'm just setting I do take the probe off the side of my fermentation vessel so that it's measuring the temperature of the chamber as opposed to that of the beer. I've done it both ways. I don't think it matters. I just don't want my compressor running for so long on the freezers. That's why I do that. And then I let it sit at 32F for a day. I go back. I very gently add gelatin so as not to introduce too much oxygen. Let it sit for one more day. I rack that clear beer into a keg. I burst carbonate it at 50 PSI for about 12 hours before reducing the gas and drinking it. And usually at that point, the beer is almost clear. After about 4 or 5 days in the keg, I honestly, these things are brilliantly clear typically and taste delicious. I've entered a few I don't like to compete so much these days. It's not something I get much out of, but I've had to do it for fun with warm fermented lager beers, and I've yet to receive any feedback indicating that there's any esters, phenols, diacetyl, acetaldehyde, anything like that. In my experience, it's almost like using this warm fermentation method has actually led to lower risk of off flavors being in these otherwise clean, tasty beers.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to see this. Everything that we spent the entire first half of the show talking about is, how it created this lager yeast that ferments at colder temperatures and produces this crisp, clean beer. And then here you go, you're just bucking the whole thing and saying, nope, I'm going to ferment it at ale temperatures and see how it goes. To me, this is why I love Brewlosophy. I love people doing experiments and testing out these kinds of things and seeing what works, because this is just fascinating to me. Now, I said earlier, I've never actually done this method before. I'd done something, what I would call a tweak, and it was totally accidental. I had no intention of doing this. But what I did was I crashed my beer. I got it down to about 50 or about 48 or so. Pitched my yeast, set my regulator or my temperature controller to 55, and then just left the beer alone. What I didn't realize is that I had unplugged my fermentation chamber from the temperature controller.
We've all done that, I think. It's a rite of passage.
Yeah, I was cleaning it out, and I just forgot to plug it back in. So I came back, 5 or 6 days later, and I think this is, in the spring or early summer, and the temperature of the beer was sitting at 75. And I was going, what the hell? Oh my God, what happened?
I've ruined my beer.
Yeah, I've ruined my beer. This is a lager. Lagers can't get up to 75. Right. Who knows what I just did? But of course, I wasn't going to throw away 5 gallons of beer without at least giving it a try. So I just plugged in my fermentation chamber, chilled it back down, I think to like 66 at that point. Let it sit for another couple of days and then tried it, and it came out just fine. Yeah. It was great. I didn't notice any different whenever I did it.
You mentioned that, our willingness to do crazy stuff like this is part of what you love about Brewlosophy. It's also what some people who I don't understand hate about brewlosophy, which I'm okay with. The reality is that this is a very trend bucking approach to making lagers. And there are people out there who are very, like emotionally attached to the traditional approach, particularly when it comes to making lagers. So I'm not, prepared to say that you can get away with doing this and it would produce the exact same results as if you were to cold ferment, though we have done a lot of experiments. And what we've been able to show is that for a good portion of the lager yeasts that are commonly used by brewers, you can get away with doing that, at least on a sensory level. There are certain strains, for example, the Mexican lager yeast, the Modelo strain, seems to produce a little bit of a difference. Not necessarily saying that neither, the warm fermented one doesn't taste like a lager. It just does seem to create some sort of a detectable difference. And the same goes for one of my favorite strains, Imperial Yeast L17 Harvest. In that one, people were able to detect a difference between the one fermented at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19C from the one fermented at 10C or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But the odd thing about it was that when in post, survey conversations, the one that people seemed to think was most lager-like was the one fermented warm, which go figure, It leads me to wonder if warming that beer up or fermenting it warm and allowing it to go through all of that stuff at that warmer temperature just doesn't expedite the typical process, and that by fermenting cool, you are extending the rate at which everything is going to happen. And since that beer wasn't left alone for 2 months or whatever it might be, that perhaps it just still had more aging to do in order to catch up with the warm fermented one. Because neither of them had any notice in any of my experiences with warm fermenting lagers. I've never gotten increased ester profile and that was the big fear, going into this. So make of this what you will. If you are a fan of lagers and you prefer sticking to traditional methods, by all means, nobody's trying to talk you out of doing that. If you want to have some fun making lagers or have something new on tap at your place, give this a shot. If you don't want to wait 6+ weeks to turn it around, I don't think you'll be disappointed. I certainly haven't been, and I've been doing this stuff for a long time. Again, my opinion, but that's where I'm at. The good majority of the lagers that I make these days, pretty much unless I'm doing an experiment where it requires cooler fermentation, I'm fermenting at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19C.
Yeah, I'm totally there with you too. I mean, and I'm glad that you brought up, sort of different strains, because even we've at Brewlosophy have shown that some of those strains, some of this stuff may be strain dependent. Okay, some of this could be. That there is actually something that's happening at the higher temperatures that are causing, a different profile, a different sensory perception. It could also be that time and keeping things cold and lagering actually does produce a different beer. If we repeated that experiment 100 times or 200 times or 500 times, who knows? Maybe the results would be different. I don't think anybody here is saying that this is the only way that you should do it, or that this should now become the new dogma.
Yeah, right.
just ferment all your lagers at 66F and don't do it. Let them raise up to 75 and don't give a crap about how you're doing your beer. But at the same time, we're not saying those things, but at the same time, hey, if these things work and you can shave some time off of your process and still make a beer that's good enough for you, I mean, that's why what's enjoyable to me about the science of brewing is finding these things that can cut down on time. I don't have to do 2 months on my cultures anymore. I can do 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And to me, that's great because that means I can always have it on tap. That's a beer that I love and I can keep it around all the time, and so that's why I brew, and that's why I love to do this for Brewlosophy and love to read about these experiments for all of those reasons. So, this one, the lager method, the quick lager method, was really meaningful for me. I haven't traditionally brewed a lager in probably a year and a half or so, and haven't noticed any differences. So for me, I'm not going to go back to brewing traditional lager methods unless somebody can show me a reason that has a perceptible sensory impact. That produces a better beer, which I still haven't seen yet. So for me, I'm going to continue doing it this way.
Yeah, and a not only a perceptibly different beer, but one that I subjectively prefer. I mean, that's the thing where I'm at. And you hear all the time these people who get caught up on wanting to, shame other brewers for the way that they're approaching brewing. Shut up. I mean, God damn. Who cares what other people do? It's like our recent episode on the New England IPA Haze Craze thing. Who cares if people want to drink it? I mean, we might have our personal opinions, but my God, to try to influence other people to make yourself feel better, get over yourself is all I got to say. So, well, I trust some people out there are cringing pretty hard right now after listening to that. But perhaps, I mean, I'm sure there are people who are offended by it as well. Our lack of appreciation for tradition or for the giants on whose shoulders we stand. That's perfectly fine by me. We certainly didn't intend to hurt anybody's feelings. I promise you that. But, you do you. This is just beer. Make what you like, the way that you like it, and carry on. Cade, do you have anything else before we head out?
Nope. It's time for me to go get a Kolsch from the garage.
Oh, man. And some barbecue, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right, man. Well, don't forget to head over to brewlosophy.com to read about all of the experimental stuff we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.